Welcome to this audio session recording taken at the Agroforestry Show, which was organised in September 2023 as a partnership between the Woodland Trust and the Soil Association. For more session recordings, go to agroforestryshow.com or explore and subscribe to the Agroforestry Show YouTube channel. Enjoy!
For Kent Wildlife Trust and for Wilder Carbon. So just to kind of explain the relationship between the two, Wilder Carbon's a not-for-profit limited subsidiary of Kent Wildlife Trust Group. Kent Wildlife Trust is a parent charity, and Wilder Carbon's the third UK carbon code, selling credits at the moment in the UK voluntary carbon market. So I kind of moonlight, same role, but I moonlight in two organisations, so I crop up in a few different places. Basically, in a nutshell, to describe my role, I kind of manage the nature-based solutions team and the monitoring and evidence team. The nature-based solutions team kind of focuses on the green finance options out there at the moment, so carbon, blue carbon, nutrient neutrality, and biodiversity net gain. And we see how we can leverage those private finance options to basically scale up and grow conservation delivery on the landscape scale. And this is backed up and supported by the monitoring and evidence team, who, aside from doing the species and conservation project work, we also look into the monitoring, reporting, and verification procedures that kind of underpin a lot of these natural capital markets and establishing the kind of best practice in doing those. The reason for that, just to kind of lead us into it, is basically that the if you have practical delivery without robust monitoring protocols underpinning it, then you risk greenwashing. And if greenwashing happens, then a lot of people lose out, but nature's first and foremost among those. So, hand over to Liz.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Liz Bowles. I'm the Chief Exec of the Farm Carbon Toolkit. I think some of you may have been over to see our stand. We're over beside the Farmers Weekly. And actually, on a personal note, before I introduce myself, I used to be the Associate Director for Farming and Land Use at the Soil Association. And just before I left, we were talking about this agroforestry event today. And it's fantastic to see it such a success. So really take my hats off to Woodland Trust and Soil Association for pulling off such a great day. But my role, as I mentioned, I'm the Chief Exec at the Farm Carbon Toolkit. We're an organisation that's devoted to helping farmers to understand their greenhouse gas emissions, to help them work towards how they can reduce those emissions, and also to store more carbon both in soils and in non-crop biomass, in hedges and trees. And certainly, we're very much focused on helping farmers to reduce emissions, because that is such a massive challenge that we're all facing today. And we do that in two ways. We've got a team of advisors who really go down farm tracks, work with farmers day in, day out. And we've also developed one of the three most popular carbon calculators in the UK. And our calculator looks at whole farm carbon balance rather than simply measuring emissions per kilogram of product. So in that way, we're slightly different to other calculators. And just to explain, we've set up a partnership with Wilder Carbon because at the Farm Carbon Toolkit, we're never going to trade carbon ourselves, because we want to be in that space supporting farmers to reduce emissions and build carbon. But we felt that for some of our farmers, they would be interested in identifying what markets they could enter with safety. And in our view, Wilder Carbon is one of those. And I'll talk about more of that later. I'll hand over to Dan now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daan van der Bekker. I'm the Head of Sustainability for the BSI, the British Standards Institute. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really mean that. As you can probably hear, I'm from the Netherlands. I moved to the UK recently, and I don't think I've ever been around this area. But I can already tell you it's better to be here than in an office in West London. So we are the BSI. We are the UK's national standards body. We develop standards. We publish some 3,000 standards each year, all underpinned by a collaborative approach where we engage a wide range of industry experts and market stakeholders. We have some 30 or 35,000 standards, national, international, on probably pretty much every topic that you can think of. We also have standards specifically aimed for farmers, particularly around agricultural machinery or around health and safety aspects of fertilizers. But I think that most of you will be more familiar with schemes set by retailers towards their suppliers, like Red Tractor or Global Gap. The one thing that I like to mention is that it's key to understand that the BSI, as the national standards body, that we are impartial, we are independent, we are not for profit, and we're apolitical. What we do is we develop standards, but more importantly, by developing standards, we build trust. The reason I'm here is that one of the things I do is that I lead our work on nature-based solutions, and one of my key projects is around nature investment standards, and I will tell you a bit more about it in a minute. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we're going to start by talking a bit about the methods for creating baselines and monitoring carbon stocks with Liz, and then we'll hand over to Dan for how working at a landscape level can enhance carbon capture. And then we'll hand over to Dan for how to access trustworthy markets while avoiding greenwashing. And then we'll go to questions. And then after that, if there's still people that want to talk about this, we're going to do a little workshop afterwards. So you can come and have a drink with us and talk about your specific land and what we can do there for you. So I'll hand over to Liz.
Thank you very much, Natasha. So I've been talking to farmers literally all day today, and the sort of 3 questions that I'm going to address in my 10 minutes very much come from the conversations that I've been having all day. So the first question really is, what do farmers perhaps need to be doing right now in this space? And certainly, if I was channeling our technical director, Becky Wilson, who I expect some of you may well know, she would say the best thing you could be doing right now is to do a baseline for your business. If you haven't done it 20 years ago, do it now. And that makes infinite sense for 2 reasons. Firstly, that baseline should be primarily to measure the greenhouse gas emissions on your farm, and secondly, to identify the potential you have for carbon storage and identify your current stocks of carbon on farm. So how do you do that? There are at least 3 calculators commonly used in the UK, and our farm carbon calculator is one of them. As I mentioned before, the calculators do things slightly differently. Ours actually looks at whole farm carbon balance, so we measure emissions and we also measure sequestration. Not all calculators do that, because certainly when all this came in, many of the businesses that buy from farmers were only interested in the emissions per kilogram of product that they were selling in order to be able to make good on their commitments to the SBTi. So they'd made commitments, they needed to better demonstrate progress towards net zero. Then they suddenly realised that a lot of their emissions were actually sitting at scope 3 on farms, which is why suddenly over the last 2 or 3 years, many supply chains now will send out people to do a footprint for their suppliers, and they will use a range of different calculators. Our calculator is actually free for farmers to use, so any of you can go online, probably within half an hour you'll have got halfway to producing your whole farm carbon footprint. So in terms of just of demystifying it in producing a footprint report, effectively you're being asked to identify the different sources of emissions on your farm and putting them into a calculator, which then effectively mirrors what's going on your farm in terms of how all the interactions between soils, crops, livestock, use of inputs, in order to produce a list of your emissions of methane, nitrous oxide, and of carbon dioxide. As well then, on the sequestration side, what we do is, if you've taken soil samples from your ground at least twice, at least a year apart, and if you've done a soil bulk density, we can estimate the amount of carbon that's either being lost or being sequestered in your soils. And we also do something similar for hedges and trees. And perhaps if you remember just one number, because I'm not going to throw hardly any numbers at you, the one number to think about as a farmer, we have probably the best potential of any business organisation in the world to store carbon in a fairly low-tech way, which is to sequester carbon into soil. And for every 0.1% increase in soil organic matter, that's equivalent to 9 tonnes of carbon per hectare. So if you can increase your soil organic matter levels by 0.1% per 0.1% across your farm in a year, that's equivalent to 9 tonnes of carbon per hectare. Now, what I would say, though, is don't get carried away into thinking, that's great, I can sell that carbon, because certainly I appreciate full well with the loss of BPS, many farmers are looking at alternative income streams. But I'll come on to that in a minute in terms of these voluntary carbon markets, some of the things you need to be aware of. But just remember that number because it's huge, and it's the power that agriculture has to lock up carbon. So in doing that baseline, what you'll be doing is identifying the hotspots on your farm. And certainly with our calculator, we produce a whole load of donuts so you can see in each of the different areas, whether that be livestock, inputs, inventory, etc., where your hotspots are. If you're an arable farmer, it's likely, well, if you're not an organic arable farmer, that is, it's likely to be fertilizer, your use of fossil fuel-based fertilizers. And that is a significant source of greenhouse gases in agriculture. That and manures and how we manage, store them and spread them. If you're a ruminant livestock farmer, your greatest source of emissions is likely to be methane from the animals themselves. Now, I'm sure many of you will have sort of heard about the discussion, let's call it that, about how best to characterize methane within agricultural systems, because methane is a much shorter-lived greenhouse gas than both carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. But I'm not going to cover that now because I've got 10 minutes, but it feels like that's an area. All I will say, though, is increasingly livestock farmers would like to see GWP star taken on board because that properly assigns the shorter lifespan of methane. But of course, it puts more of those emissions into the earlier years. So it's perhaps not the panacea that some people think it is, unless you're maintaining an even number of livestock in your herd or flock. So that baseline is really important. But then what's more important is what you do with it. Okay? So having got your numbers, my advice is you look at the hotspots, where are most of my emissions coming from, and then start to think about what can I do to actually reduce them. Now, this is quite important because within the next 30 years, we have, as a country, everybody has to get to net zero. And it simply isn't good enough to store carbon into soils if we don't at the same time reduce those emissions, i.e. if we don't stop putting more gases up into the atmosphere. So, and I think agriculture, and I'm going to give you one other number actually. I often get asked to talk to journalists, and I always ask them this question. I ask them, so what proportion of the total UK greenhouse gas emissions do you think are attributed to agriculture? Now, I think I'm good. I don't know if you probably all know the answer, so I'm not going to tax you. Actually, I will ask you this though. What answer do you think they give me? So agriculture only. 70. That's a weighty number. Okay. And any other thoughts on that? 50. Okay. 50, 70. 14. Did you say? 14. Okay. So I did this recently for a bit of fun with a journalist who was writing an article on can cows be carbon neutral. The answer he gave me was 32%. Now, bear in mind, he was actually researching this topic. So the actual answer last year was 11%. So according to DEFRA statistics, 11% of total UK greenhouse gases are attributed to agriculture. So it's not a lot. Well, it's enough. And the reality is this. As other sources of greenhouse gases go down, agriculture's contribution is going to go up. So that doesn't mean we do nothing, because we can and we should. So having got your baseline, then, the next thing really is to look at all those hotspots, see where the hotspots are for your farm business, and then start thinking, okay, so what can I do to reduce those emissions alongside storing more carbon into soils and non-crop biomass? And that, I'm not suggesting here by any manner of means get rid of ruminant livestock, not at all, because the bit that we probably will regret at leisure is the intensification of ruminant livestock, moving them indoors because of the impact that has on biodiversity on farm. Because certainly I'm very clear that we're not going to address climate change effectively unless we also reverse the decline in nature. And grazing livestock have a huge role to play in supporting biodiversity on grassland. But what we can do is look at some of those sources of emissions to reduce use of fertilizers, either looking at different ways of cropping, different crops indeed, that don't require such a level of fertilizer, and certainly looking at improving livestock health and welfare, because that does improve emissions per se. I mean, if you think about it, I don't know how many of you are livestock producers. I'm a sheep farmer down in Devon in my spare time, although it doesn't sometimes feel like that. And classically, you know, we all know that if an animal doesn't get to its intended destination, effectively, all those emissions will still have been emitted for nothing. So that will massively increase your footprint for animal production. So anything you can do which improves the longevity of animals on your farm, improves their performance in terms of health and welfare, all these things are really important. And in a way, they're not rocket science, but they all do help. So think about that. Also think about, if you're feeding livestock, not just on forage, think about where those feedstuffs come from. And if you can, I mean, the worst of all is using imported products, especially from areas that have been deforested. That's like top, you know, that's literally, I don't know what you call it in darts or whatever the thing is at the top, but that's the worst you can get. And certainly by reducing or removing soya from a dairy cow diet, and this is another number I do remember, probably reduces overall emissions by something like 20%. So it's significant. So that's the second thing. Having done your baseline, then look at your hotspots, develop a plan, get advice if you need it on how to reduce it, and then get started. So that's the first thing I was going to cover, and I'm very conscious that I haven't got a watch, so Natasha, you tell me to stop, okay? I've got two other things I was going to cover, so I'll carry on. The second thing, which I think my colleagues will also cover, and this is something that we get asked about all the time, and I feel that it's almost, the question is, what do farmers need to know about the voluntary carbon markets? And I think the answer is to be diligent, to really do your homework, and to not take anything at face value at the moment. And I think, if I'm honest, the things I would say is that within the voluntary carbon market, just consider this, for something that will be considered robust in 5 years' time, any additional carbon that is stored and seeks a payment needs to be permanent. The activity required to store it needs to be additional to normal farming activity, and it should not be reversed. So these, and actually, just think about that for a minute in terms of the kind of carbon that's being marketed. It needs to be permanently there, and that permanence can be, at the moment, it can be anything from 10 years to 50 years. So question mark, really, its benefit if it's there simply for 10 years, because we're looking at a 30-year window. The other thing I would say that as a farmer you need to think about is how it affects your ability to produce food or what else you want to do on farm. So it feels like really finding out as much as you can about who's buying it and how you feel about selling carbon to some businesses that you may or may not feel are actually acting in the right way. And certainly from Farm Carbon Toolkit, our position is very clear. We feel that anybody entering this market as a buyer needs, first of all, to have done everything they can possibly do to reduce their emissions before looking to purchase carbon offsets. And that really goes back to what I said right at the outset, that all of us have to reduce emissions first and foremost, because we have to put less emissions up into the air. So if those businesses are choosing to purchase carbon offsets as a cheaper way of reducing their overall emissions or getting them to net zero, rather than doing the hard yards, which is reducing emissions, that's not doing what it's intended to do. So that really means that as a purchaser, they need to be doing that first. And for farm businesses, as a seller, our view at Farm Carbon Toolkit certainly is that, first of all, we need to get ourselves to net zero as a farming business before we look to sell or indeed trade those carbon offsets within our own supply chains. Because I don't know how many of you in the audience are farmers and how many are already being asked to have a carbon footprint done on your businesses. I won't ask you to put your hands up, it always feels too hot to put a hand up. But it's certainly increasing, and we work within dairy supply chains, potato supply chains, fresh produce supply chains, and all of those are being asked by their customers now to come up with a number every year for what their footprint is. So that kind of leads me into the third area, which I'm more going to pose questions than answers, because at the moment there really aren't many answers, which is how do we, all of us, work together within supply chains to actually manage to do this effectively, to reduce emissions across the whole supply chain, and how can that be done fairly? I'm hearing talk at the moment within supply chains that obviously different farms will have different positions when they come to do their carbon baseline. Some of them may already be better than net zero. Others may want some of that carbon to get them to net zero. How do we manage that interface with the customer that's buying products from farmers, especially as we also, many of you will be selling to more than one supply chain. And all these things are currently being discussed, but I would say, certainly from what I see at the moment, a lot of it is coming from supply chains or your customers saying to you, we want you to do ... But there's increasingly, the question then becomes, is there a cost associated with making those changes? And if so, who's actually going to bear the cost of making those changes? And both the Downs who are going to speak next are really going to start to address those questions. So thank you very much.
So, as I outlined in my initial introduction, basically my job and that of my team is to look into the project development and delivery of these carbon offsetting projects across the United Kingdom. So we're kind of the devil in the detail focus on this one, and we're trying to unpick the challenges of applying this MBS green finance on a different scales, different farms, different land holdings. And that can be a single farm, it could be a cluster of farmers, or it could be an amalgamation of private landowners spread across a large area. And in fact, Wilder Carbon is providing the advice and carbon monitoring plan for many of the landscape recovery projects across the UK at the moment. So we can operate on different scales, and we're trying to work out how that works. It's a pretty complicated picture, as I'm sure you're all aware. I just want to stress, like from the title of my talk, there's a lot of synergy between what biodiversity and carbon capture needs on a landscape level and what actually I believe the agricultural sector needs to consider when looking forwards and considering the myriad challenges that are basically being faced at the moment. We all know what they are, but I think it's worth always highlighting these again. There's the uncertainty over the public finance available, the loss of BPS, countryside stewardship moving towards the environmental land management schemes. What are they? What do they look like? The emerging natural capital markets, how are they operating? How do we guarantee delivery? How can we assure trust in those markets that we're actually going to get the income? There's also climate change and the now pretty much certain changes to certain agricultural systems that are going to be prevalent in the UK as a result of these rising temperatures across in Kent. Soft fruit production is a really big form of agriculture for us. It's heavily water intensive. We're having increasing droughts every single summer. And there's no way that's going to survive with the predicted increased changes to the temperature at the moment, and the farmers are aware of that. So change is needed. And finally, the dreaded policy changes. These things can change on a hairpin, as we recently found out with nutrient neutrality very, very recently. I just want to stress, again, agroforestry is kind of one example of this. So it's diversification of the income sources to grow resilience in the business model and create a sustainable business model that is resilient to changes in the external factors in the long term. And natural capital can provide that additional income stream, but it comes with added benefits in the sense that if it's done properly, and I stress that if it's done properly, through nature-based solutions, it can deliver a host of co-benefits to society, nature, and the economy. So our approach for Wilder Carbon is that nature is essentially the vehicle behind this. So if we prioritise nature recovery in the carbon offsetting projects, then nature acts as an environmental safeguard to ensure carbon capture, which in turn ensures that the carbon will be generated and we can sell it on the market. So I'll come on to that now. So in terms of Wilder Carbon, it was obviously established by Kent Wildlife Trust. We are a nature conservation charity, as hopefully you're aware, and is set up with the explicit purpose of basically enabling nature recovery on the landscape scale through the voluntary carbon market. So we have an eye to delivering the nature recovery network and utilising the carbon markets to achieve this. And we do it by creating and restoring UK native habitat through minimum intervention wild grazing kind of approach. So essentially that's looking at developing ecosystem resilience, and to do that we have to look at the landscape scale. Again, that resilience is restoring natural processes, which underpins the whole regenerative agriculture terminology we're talking about here. So there is great synergy between landscape recovery for nature and what the regenerative agriculture is essentially trying to achieve. In a kind of very gross simplification of the process, we essentially kind of develop management and monitoring plans for these sites. We then quantify the carbon units, validate them with the Soil Association, which are only 2 bodies in the UK currently accredited to validate them, and then we sell them on the UK voluntary carbon market. It's a bit of a gross simplification, but I don't have too long to go into it. But if you want to talk afterwards in the workshop, I'm happy to go into a bit more detail as to what we do. It's worth mentioning now as well, we differ in a few different ways to the other UK carbon codes, so the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Carbon Code. But one of them is particularly important for this idea of landscape scale nature recovery. And that is that we essentially can operate across a range of different habitats on the one site. So not just prioritising the development of, say, woodland or scrubland or one particular habitat type. And this is really important from the nature recovery perspective, because in the farming sector, if you have just one crop over a huge area, it's called a monoculture. And the same thing can apply to nature. And monoculture is not good for nature in terms of that. So it needs this diversity of different habitats. It needs this, nature thrives in the kind of messy boundaries between these places. So you need that complexity of structure to increase biodiversity. Because nature farms have a really important role to basically play in this equation, because if we can get it right, the farms can fit towards this wider nature recovery network. You can expand the existing protected sites, create new habitat and act like wildlife corridors, and all the while it can be supported through the voluntary carbon markets, and the payment that can be received through this. So let's come on to the kind of logistics and how we actually work this out. So we only sell to approved buyers. So I know this has been raised a bit about the carbon offsetting piece. The approved buyers on our books are basically organisations that have got a demonstrable and actionable climate reduction plan, which clearly outlines they've done a carbon footprint, they know what their existing balance is, and they've got their actions laid out to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and they're actually doing them. They're not just talking about doing them. And only then will we sell the carbon offsets to them through our projects. So that's a measure of trying to generate trust in this, because I know that's a really big issue with the UK voluntary carbon market at the moment. The next one is that we're supported by a network of trusted deliverers. So we operate nationally. Obviously, Kent is only in Kent, but Wilder Carbon operates across with these trusted deliverers. These are all nature conservation charities with a proven, demonstrable track record of basically delivering nature conservation projects. It's their bread and butter, it's what they're set up to do. And the reason we brought them into this is because the nature conservation charities can guarantee practical delivery. Nature conservation is what they've been doing for a long time. Guarantees delivery, guarantees biodiversity improvement, and it can guarantee carbon capture. So again, it's one of our approaches to trying to build this trust and high integrity approach in the UK voluntary carbon market that hasn't been around at the moment to now. And then finally, for each of the projects and sites which we look into, we do look at local nature recovery strategies, nature recovery networks, identify local species and habitat priorities, speak to the landowner, understand what biodiversity is on your land, and then we tailor the specific habitats and the changes on your land to the local area. So in other words, we're not just coming in and applying a blunt tool and chucking whatever habitat kind of down. We're working within the context to generate the best solution. Because if it's the best solution for nature in your locale, it will be the best solution in terms of guaranteeing carbon capture, because it's going to fit with the landscape around you. Just to touch on, it's a little bit off topic, but I think it's probably worth just touching a slight bit on nutrient neutrality. Obviously, very recently, there were some policy changes that have basically pulled the rug slightly underneath some of the credits around the nutrient neutrality schemes. It's very short-sighted. I'm not going to get political about it, although I really could, but it's a short-sighted, short-term mindset. And unfortunately for us, this basically just reduces trust in these emerging markets. It reduces trust in the natural capital markets, and trust is exactly what people like myself, Liz and Dan are trying to build, and our organisations are trying to build in them. These markets really do present us with a really exciting opportunity to actually blend public and private finance. That's another area which we're trying to unpick at the moment, to blend them together to develop a more diverse farm system that has greater income streams and can generate a bit more resilience in the long term. So hopefully through my talk, and again, please do shout any questions afterwards if you've got them, but hopefully I've demonstrated that nature-based solutions, if done correctly, they can deliver carbon in line with your business needs. They can deliver resilient ecosystems, they can deliver biodiversity gains, and also they can work within your farming system to what your business needs. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. I just want to talk about, tell you a little bit more about one of the programs we do, which is around nature investment standards. And it's a very exciting program. It's a program that's close to my heart, and the reason is that it's about nature, it's about investment in nature, and it is about how standards can support that. We started this program earlier this year in March. It's a 3-year partnership that we have with DEFRA, and it really is one of the interventions that the government has put into place as part of the Green Finance Strategy. And you're probably aware that the Green Finance Strategy and the Environmental Improvement Plan have set out a strategy to first halt and then reverse the decline in nature. And sustained government funding has an important role to play in this. But government can't do this alone. And to that end, the Green Finance Strategy and the Nature Market Framework have set an, I have to say, ambitious goal to grow private annual private investment flows to nature towards 1 billion by 2030. And one of the mechanisms to enable this flow of private investments is a nature market. Now, what are nature markets? I think you're all aware of the concept of carbon markets. And just like you can trade in carbon credits, you can trade in nature. You can put a value on nature, which we then call an ecosystem service. So for example, if you restore a wetland, restoring a wetland will provide nature services like flood control, like water purification, like an increase in wildlife habitat. And these services you can monetize. You can put a value on them. And once you monetize them, you can trade them. But for markets, whether they're carbon markets or nature markets or any other markets, for markets to be effective and trusted, you need clarity and you need confidence in these markets. And I think that's where BSI comes in. What we have been doing over the last couple of months is building a framework of standards to boost market confidence and to increase private sector investment in nature. So how have we been doing that? We started to create a new consensus-based UK-wide standards framework that sets out clear high-integrity principles. Principles that drive efficiency, greater clarity, and rigor. And examples of those market principles include additionality, no double counting, robust quantification, transparency, validation, verification, etc. And I think it's important to note, like I said in my introduction, is that this is not something the BSI has come up with. This is led by the industry. I think we interviewed some 300 market experts. We run 12 workshops and roundtables. We run a webinar with 320 companies. We set up a strategic advisory group. So this is something led by the market, by industry consensus. A couple of weeks ago, we published our first summary report, which is publicly available, and which really is an update to the market of the direction of where the program is heading. Earlier this week, on Monday, we started with the second phase of the program, which is about developing priority standards. So standards around natural carbon benefits, around biodiversity, about nutrients. And then later in the program, we will start to develop additional market standards, which can be around biointegrity, flood management, etc. So the benefit for farmers here is that the program will provide them with an opportunity to participate in a nature market that they can trust. And it would also provide them with an opportunity to incentivize their income. So it's a bit of a complicated program, and it's challenging to explain it to you in such a short time. But I'd like to leave you with 3 things. This program will help to build trustworthy markets and increase the private sector investment in nature. And secondly, this program can help to restore nature. But the program depends on farmers to continue with the supply in nature projects. And thirdly, we cannot do this alone. And I think that's the most important one. We are incredibly keen to learn from farmers, from suppliers, and from everyone here in the room how to move forward with this program. And I think I want to extend an open invitation to all of you to come and work with us and to help us to build a credible market in nature. Thank you.
Okay, thanks guys. Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well to know that there are so many private companies that want to get involved in this from basically all over the world at the moment. So it's a really big growing market. So I'm going to hand it over to you guys for questions. Can we get the guy over there with the stripy top?
Very interesting. Thank you to everyone. I think this is a question for Liz. Obviously, Farm Carbon Toolkit does some really great work. I totally agree with what you're saying about, the farmer needs to think about insetting their own whole footprint emissions, and I'm really pleased that Carbon Toolkit does that in terms of the calculator. Without doing any, obviously we're here talking about agroforestry, without making any additional planting of hedges, trees, whatever, an average farm, what sort of percentage of the farms that you see going through that toolkit actually have, after their own footprint, spare carbon to sell?
Wow. So I almost feel like I want to say I'm the CEO. I'm only the CEO. So in terms of the proportion, it varies in different sectors. I have to say that in my experience, certainly unless you include your carbon sequestration into soils and hedges and trees, as a farm business, especially if you're a ruminant livestock farm business, you will not be at net zero unless you do include those things, simply because of the methane emissions from the ruminants themselves. If you're an arable farmer and you're not using fossil fuel-based fertilizers, then your sources of emissions are lower, because effectively it will be based on fuel usage and losses from soil on cultivations, and also emissions from whatever sources of fertilizer you are using. Because for most inputs, there will be an emissions factor, because you've got to think about the emissions associated with the production of those inputs and the use of those inputs. But I think I understand the question that you're really asking is, what do farms have to do to be their own insetters, really? And the answer to that question is really improving soil health will be massive. But as I said earlier, all of us as farm businesses, and I include myself because I produce lamb, and my lambs just have to ruminate, and out comes the methane. So all of us have to do, a bit like Dan was saying, on having approved buyers who are doing everything they can. Farm businesses, we also need to look at what we can do, identify our hotspots, and then set about putting together a plan. And it won't be possible to get rid of all those emissions, just like it isn't for other businesses. But we can do so much more than we are already. And I think certainly when I worked at the Soil Association, probably back as late as 2018, it would have been a hard thing to talk about the need to reduce reliance on fossil-based fertilizers. That's become a whole load easier in recent years, primarily because the stuff has probably priced itself out of the market, and also because farmers are fully starting to see that number is a big number on their footprint. And it is interesting. It's like a whole new language. I very often do presentations where I'll just literally put up a slide which says the emissions associated with a whole load of inputs and the sequestration associated with different things. And it's like, for all of us, it's learning a new language. I hope that helps.
I've got to admit to being philosophically opposed to monetising and trading nature services, just to say that to start. But it seems to be the only show in town, so I really, really hope that what you guys are doing can work. However, to give me some confidence, could you I can get carbon. I don't believe in the accuracy of its measurement yet, but when it comes to nature services, how are you? I just don't understand how it works. I mean, do you equate a certain number of points to an earthworm and certain numbers to a barn owl and certain numbers to an orchid? I mean, because at some point you've got to come up with one universal figure which you can trade, and I just don't understand it. Can you elucidate?
I'm trying to work. Is that in reference to carbon biodiversity net gain?
Biodiversity net gain, let's say.
Biodiversity net gain. So that basically works by using the UK standard in habitat surveying, which is UK HABS. So it classifies different habitats by different condition status and different criteria, different species. And so that's the fundamental level on how the different habitats are determined. And then there's different parameters that basically the DEFRA metric encompasses. Now, I will caveat all this, because I've argued with DEFRA, the metric is a blunt tool, which isn't exactly fit for purpose in its entirety. But we've got to accept that there's a bit of a starting point to this. And the metric, if nothing else, is a bit of a starting point to kind of move in the right direction. I'll tell you some flaws, because I know them myself, and I've spoke to them about it. They don't consider species. They're too habitat focused, and from a nature perspective, they don't consider species at all. And that is a big gap in there. And also the inflexibility of it. They're a bit of a red line boundary kind of thing that doesn't blend well with different types of finance, and that's a huge, huge, huge problem for rolling this stuff out at scale. So the only kind of thing I can say to that is that it's a good starting point in that we need a starting point, and we need to work with them to refine it and rebuild it a little bit. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I really do want to believe it, but and I trust you guys, actually. I mean, which is rare. But you hear so many people on these stages talking about this as if there's a sort of precision which just doesn't exist. I mean, my worry is that it's emperor's clothes, and they're going to fall off at some point, and the whole thing will collapse. So, yeah, I guess please carry on, setting up the standards and so that it can be trustworthy. But thanks.
So on that point, how do you expect the Environment Agency's new Natural Capital Register and Accounting tool, NCRAT, to affect this new market? Because that's doing exactly that, is valuing the ecosystem services. Do we expect that to really, allow us to start trading ecosystem services on the open market soon? Or, I don't know, it's very new. It's literally released like 2 weeks ago, so I don't expect you to know about it. But
for me, okay. So yeah, I think, I suppose the starting point is that this is a private industry and a private sector, as we know, so we're going to get lots of these different metrics and things cropping up all the time. It's an issue from a consistency and a standardization point of view. We need to be talking the same language, and we need to be talking the same kind of calculation and value for nature. Now, I don't try and hide the fact that I'm coming at this purely from a nature conservation lens. That's my background, is what I'm passionate about, and I really believe natural capital markets can deliver nature recovery. And for a very, very, very long time in my career, agriculture and nature just didn't really see eye to eye in my sector. There was no real balance between the two. We're being presented with a really cool opportunity through this natural capital markets to actually build a model that works. So the only thing, they can undermine the confidence in the delivery, and they can undermine the actual practical side of the delivery. And this is where diligence checks are really important with these markets, because there's a lot of figures being quoted around. Biodiversity net gain in particular is going for some astronomical sums of like £40,000 per unit at the moment around the UK. There's a lot of money on the line, and you need to be sure that those agreements can be 30 years, carbon can be 50 years. If you're signing up for something like that, it's very, very important to do the diligence on whoever you're working with to make sure that they can actually deliver this stuff, because at the end of the day, what's sometimes forgotten in all this is that it's the nature side of things that's actually the vehicle for driving these capital markets. And if these people don't know what they're doing for nature, then how are they going to deliver the natural capital?
And I'll add to that with my farmer's hat on, actually, because Dan's done my farm as a case study. I farm in Devon, permanent grassland sheep farm. And certainly what I'm beginning to understand more and more is I'd always been a great advocate of land sharing rather than land sparing. But what's really becoming clear to me is that potentially there's areas in my farm which could do probably more for nature than they do at the moment. And it's about then making sure that doing it in the right place. And I had a lovely anecdote from a business that sells cover crop seeds. And he was asked to sell a flower strip cover crop seed to a farmer. And he was an arable farmer. And this guy selling the seeds, he's got a lot of integrity, he must have. He didn't just sell the seeds. He said to him, well, what are these pollinators going to eat when these flowers have gone? And I think this is the thing that all of us as farmers we need to start thinking about actually, when we're farming, what are we providing for the wildlife that would like to call your farm home? And that needs to be somewhere to live and something to eat for all the time that they're awake and living on your farm. And if you think about it that way, that really changes how you think about how you farm. And it isn't just a nice to have, because I think, again, as Dan was saying, there was such a sort of division between environmental farming and farming for profit that, okay, if you've got a bit of rough old ground, put it into environmental stewardship, and it's a nice to have. But actually, increasingly, we're finding that those ecosystem services enable us to produce food. They don't stop us producing food, so that there is a bit of a win-win. But then in terms of entering that marketplace, I agree absolutely with Dan. It's that due diligence, because I personally wouldn't want to be doing something if it wasn't making a difference, if it wasn't actually delivering on what it was meant to be doing. We actually haven't got enough time to be messing around in not making a difference.
Yeah, I was wondering, who owns the carbon in a situation where a farm has sold it on a market, and kind of what impact does that potentially have on liabilities and risk further down the line?
Yeah, so in the projects we've worked with, it kind of basically varies. If it's a tenant farmer, then the landowner owns the asset, but then we can do a credit share agreement, basically, where there'll be, and that requires a negotiation between landowner and tenant farmer to do a split of the profit. That's one way. Obviously, if the farmer owns the land, then they own the asset.
But once you sold it, it belongs to the person who's bought it. And if you don't make good on that contract in terms of actually delivering the additional carbon that you sold, it's a bit like a grain contract. You've got to make good on it.
Yeah.
And the challenge could be, for instance, the classic one in some sort of typical things where, say, you've relied on trees to store carbon over a number of years and the trees die, you've got to replant them, but those trees won't ever produce as much carbon. So therefore you might then have to go out into the carbon market to buy carbon to give to your customer because you've already sold them that carbon.
Yeah, and it's, like half the skies above North America at the moment appear to be just carbon offsets as a result of the wildfires within Canada. And is there a potential situation where in 10 years' time there's a farmer in East Anglia who's got his soils and he's been paying for carbon for, but then he's seen 4 droughts in a row and his soils starting to emit carbon? Or could the business come after him at the price of carbon in 10 years' time to try and recoup their costs? At what point does carbon offsetting become a liability with a farm business than an opportunity?
I have to say that at the moment, unless you look at the small print of the agreement, you won't be able to know. And I think then it's about the enforceability of the agreement in how many years' time. But
so that's something to watch out for.
Absolutely.
If you're signing a contract.
Yeah,
what the resilience and adaptation and future risk management is of those.
Yeah, all of those things, because potentially it is a contract. You've agreed to supply a certain tonnage of carbon.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm sort of wearing 2 hats. I'm not a plant, but I have, in my day job, I have actually bought £15,000 of carbon credits from Wilder Carbon. And the reason being is for this integrity point. We looked at, 10, 1,500 different schemes for buying carbon, and they're a lot cheaper. Wilder Carbon is not cheap, but we bought 266 credits from them earlier this year. It won't offset all our greenhouse gas emissions from our business. We're a vertical farmer. I can talk to you about that if you're interested. But it's more about the additionality. It's about the habitat side of things that we were more interested in. And indeed, in time, I'm hoping that there will be some sort of biodiversity credit. I completely agree with the man at the front that a lot more needs to be done. And that's one of the reasons why Wilder Carbon aren't selling biodiversity credits yet. They're only selling the carbon bit because they're not quite sure about the science. So we would rather buy biodiversity credits, but we're happy that we've got skin in the game, and in the future we might be able to do that. So I promise I'm not a plant, because I am here with my father, who's a sheep farmer from southern Scotland, and we have 1,500 acres, 3,000 sheep. But my question, I've bought 15. I've got another question. That's okay. I've spent 15,000 with one hat on. What I'm interested in with Wilder Carbon, though, or any of these schemes, is the ongoing is it just a one-off jam today, here's the carbon, and then what's it going to look like in 20, 30 years' time? How is it, if you're going to change the way you farm in order to create biodiversity and carbon benefits for your new customers who are not buying meat, they're buying a service, is that a one-off? How do you, is it up to the farmer to manage that cash flow over the long term, or is there a way where you're being paid a maintenance system where you're always paid to continue doing it over the long term, maybe over a period of a tenancy or what have you?
Yeah, so essentially the sale of the carbon credits is determined on the landowner's basis, so it can completely depend on your business model on when you want the credits to go. We only sell 50% of the units up front, and we hold 50% back as a reserve. Again, it's an element of cautionary approach to make sure we can actually deliver the units on the site. And then from that 50%, how much you want to sell is completely dependent. Like, we're working with one landowner who, obviously, you need a certain amount of cash flow up front to basically precipitate some of these works on the ground, and then putting a plan in place for how that sale of units can go. So it's entirely at the landowner's discretion in terms of when the units can be sold. They are validated on a kind of framework set by the Soil Association, so every 5 years a unit should be validated. That's fixed, that's kind of national. But yeah, in terms of how many you sell, that can be determined by the landowner.
But in terms of that cash flow, though, so if the payment's up front, the obligation still sits with the landowner to deliver what was agreed in the agreement, and also, I would imagine, to fund that verification that has indeed occurred, and that can go on for a lot of years. So, and certainly it's conversations that, in fact, I was talking to Jeremy Moody from the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers just today, because he's here today, and clearly there's lots of things to sort out. I understand that the Treasury is minded to see this as income rather than capital, which does mean that whenever you take that income into your business, you will be taxed on it. So, all these things need to be thought about, and, agriculture is a multi-generational game. What does that mean for the next generation? So all of that needs to be properly and fully thought through.
Thank you. I'd love the panel's thoughts on whether the ability to trade carbon forward, so the promise to deliver a carbon unit, is actually one of the fundamental problems here, and it's not that you're trading a sequestered carbon unit. I'd love your thoughts on that, please.
So, essentially, in terms of... sorry, can you say that question again in terms of the...
Sure. So the ability to trade which is almost all the carbon out there, is being traded on the promise to deliver. So the tree goes in the ground. Well, it's going to become an oak tree over 100 years, a full-grown oak over 100 years, 200 years. But you've got the promise to deliver, or the pending issuance unit that's being derived from that. That's what's being traded, not the unit as it's being retired. Is the problem that we have the standards enable that, and if the standards didn't enable those carbon units to be traded forward, most farmers probably wouldn't get stuck on this, as some maybe, or we wouldn't be facing this same issue, because we'd be waiting for those carbon units to actually be sequestered and stored before they were then traded.
Shall I start with this one? So I think it's probably happened because one of the sort of tenets of the recommendations on best practice guidelines for agricultural soil, farm and carbon code is about this additionality. So, and I have seen examples where farmers are looking to trade carbon that's already in the ground, but that is already there. So
that's not my question, though, if you don't mind.
No,
it's much more around, I enter, you sign up, I register my carbon units at planting with the Woodland Carbon Code, Wilder Carbon, whoever it may be, and but those trees are going to grow over a lifetime, put on their biomass. That is where the carbon is stored. I could trade all of that carbon forward, which is part of the issue. If I have to wait for that carbon to be sequestered and measured at the 5, 10, 15-year point, or whatever it may be, then I don't have the issue of trading carbon forward, and I'm actually then I'm trading stored carbon, and I've still got additionality on the basis that I've registered it at the time of that habitat being created.
So my answer to that would be, it's like any forward market then, really, what is the likelihood of it actually happening? Because if it was 100% dead cert, then probably that you could trade in that forward market more safely than if you can't be certain.
That's just risk, though, isn't it?
It is, exactly. But that's what all of that is about, really, I think. I'm not sure. I'm trying to understand exactly what you're saying, because clearly in all this, the trading is on carbon that's going to be stored in the future, and you hope to hell you're going to store it if you sold it. But if you wanted to get the money more up front, then I think my guess is you'd probably have to accept a lower price for it unless that certainty was there.
Following on from that, Mike Perks, Forest Research. How do you account for future climate risk in your species or habitat plan?
So we have a pooled risk buffer across the projects. So
that's not really accounting for future climate risk. That's a risk management strategy. How do you actually account for future climate risk changing the habitat in Kent that you've promoted, and it won't deliver because it's no longer
I see what
fit
you're saying.
for the
So
climate
in
space?
terms of the actual habitat changes, well, that's where the model's adaptable. So the reason we get the trusted deliverers in is because they set up the conservation plan according to their knowledge, which is the expertise in like delivering nature conservation charities. And then we set intervention gates throughout the management plan where things can be tweaked and changed if things aren't looking as if they're moving in the right direction. The pooled risk buffer thing was more for like huge environmental changes and things like that basically mitigate for that. But that's again where that trusted deliverer confidence knowledge kind of comes into the frame, because we follow that kind of more wilding approach, which doesn't really have a fixed endpoint. So we accept that these things necessarily aren't going to generate in the way that we generate them. Again, that's why we hold back some of the carbon units, again, to accommodate for the fact that the habitats might not transition how we originally thought.
I think that's a reasonable approach. I think the really interesting example that I've come across is the peatland carbon code. And research by the Smith Group in Aberdeen shows that from a large majority of small extent blanket peatlands, there'll no longer be a functioning peatland at the end of the century. So why spend money on an activity and develop a credit when the habitat isn't going to be there because of the climate change?
So we're trying to include climate modelling into the work that we're doing when we develop the plans, but unfortunately the science isn't down to the granularity to basically give complete confidence in, like, on the field scale or the farm scale exactly what's going to happen. We can tell to an approximate region, but even that's not an exact science at this point. But we're getting there, hopefully.
Okay, we'll take one more question, and then obviously this is very, very interesting topic for a lot of people. So we're going to hang out over here, and then if you guys want to talk more afterwards, we can all go and sit and have a drink, maybe at the pub or something. Cool. One more question. There's a gentleman over there with his glasses on.
Hi. This is kind of a hardball one, but given that climate change was caused by fossil fuels coming out of the ground and they've been stored for millions of years, how can we solve that problem by growing trees on farms, which are then going to die off eventually or get chopped down and then go back into the system up above the ground? Are we not setting ourselves up for like another problem 100 years down the line when lots of farmers are kind of bought into this system and gone, hey, we're going to invest in like carbon, and everyone's going, oh, these carbon credits aren't actually worth anything because we've got to stick this carbon back into the ground again. That's the only way of solving climate change.
Okay, I'll have a go at that. I'm daft. So if you think back, the trees, what we're trying to solve right now is what the kind of existential thing that's coming down the track at us. And what we've got to do is reduce emissions and get carbon into soils and non-crop biomass. Those are the two things. And I kind of feel that alongside that, obviously, we've got to stop burning fossil fuels. We've got to find other sources for our energy, whether that be solar power, wind, whatever it is. And probably, that is, as I think finding alternatives to using fossil fuel is probably more important, if I'm absolutely brutally honest, than planting trees. But planting trees has got other benefits as well as storing carbon. So I don't think it's an either or. I think we have to do both.
Yeah, just going to echo that final statement, to be honest. I think with all these things, if you look at the aviation industry, for example, they need to massively change their processes, and they're going through huge technological advancements now, but they're basically never going to reach net zero. It's just completely impossible on the basis of how that industry works. So there's always going to be a demand as long as the policy reinforces it, but everyone has to play their part. And like as Liz says, the carbon is often separated from nature, but they're one and the same parts of the same coin. So we need to prioritize nature as the vehicle to drive the carbon capture, so there's more benefits and more value. Not to mention the ecosystem services, things like flood resilience, natural flood management, all those other things. Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening. We'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Sainsbury's, and our other major sponsors, Farmers Weekly Transition, Forestry Commission, and Till Hill, and all the attendees for making this show such an overwhelming success. To get advice and support for your agroforestry project, either visit woodlandtrust.org.uk/plant or soilassociation.org/agroforestry.